With me is radio consultant Lee Arnold, who has programmed many radio stations over the years, but mainly in rock radio, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I've done a number of different ones, but I'm known for being a rock specialist as a programmer.
And
Uh,
there's all kinds of different flavors of rock, and you've kind of been there since the beginning of the rock format when it began to evolve in the late 60s, right?
yeah, yeah. My first real job in radio was doing underground progressive slash freeform radio in late 1967. I had dabbled before that in top 40 because that was the only thing that was rock radio, but just a little bit. My first real job was putting that kind of a radio station on the air when there were very few of them.
And so that's what we're going to talk about today, how rock has evolved over the years since the 60s and how the classic rock radio format has survived through all of these different format changes. It's like one of the leading radio formats today in 2024. So what I want to talk with you about, Lee, is why that is. Why is classic rock so durable?
Well, I think there's a number of reasons. One, the target audience of classic rock is an older audience. You and I have talked about this before. It's the audience is real. Its prime audience is 55 plus, and there's a lot of them. They're still the
Baby boomers.
they're still the largest group of people out there as a subgroup, baby boomers, and it actually grows each year rather than gets smaller. Certainly will for the next 10 years. The other thing that's interesting is they spend the most time spent listening because they like radio. They grew up with radio. They grew up with top 40 radio. They transitioned in the 60s into progressive rock radio. They like radio. They don't have attitudes about it. They'll even listen to it on AM. It doesn't matter to them. They like radio. So between the fact that they're the largest group of people and they listen for the longest period of time, that gives classic rock a giant advantage. The its only disadvantage is that in most cases they don't have a great classic rock station. They have something that's all right, and that satisfies them.
High testing, high repetition formats, huh?
It satisfies them, but there's just nothing else on the dial that's better for them.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not that they're like, oh, this is the greatest station in the world. It's more like, I like these songs a lot. I grew up with them. It's music. It's the soundtrack of my life, and I know these songs. You and I have talked about this before as well. They know the song from note number one. On the station that I do called The Goat, we on Christmas we do 24 hours of the Beatles. We do a Beatles Christmas, and even the most obscure, if there's such a thing, Beatles track on an album, on the first note you're already singing along. It's like, oh, it's an old friend. It's my old friend, Hey Bulldog. So, and that's true across the board on most of the songs that you hear on classic rock radio, is they like the songs. It's the soundtrack of their lives. It's the other thing why classic rock radio works is the songs have hooks.
Plus, people know the bands. They know they can name people in the bands. Whereas in the 2000s, it's a lot more faceless bands. People don't know the members.
Yeah, absolutely true. Everybody has their favorite members of bands. They can name, in a lot of cases, they can name every single member of the band. They can tell you, oh yeah, I remember when he left and so came in, because they're real fans. They're real fans of the bands and the music, but the music itself is the key. It's got guitars, electric guitars. in most cases. 99% of the songs are built around electric guitars, the true rock instrument. The vocals are authentic. They may not, he or she may not have the greatest voice in the world, but they may have a voice that's just so authentically theirs.
Mm-hmm.
You know, whether it be Joe Cocker on one end of the extreme, or Leon Russell, or or Bob Dylan.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they don't necessarily have like operatic, magnificent voices, but they have a voice that comes from their very, very soul,
Mm-hmm.
and that touches the listener's very, very soul in response to it. So and so you have, they play guitar, they have hooks in the songs, they authentically sing the songs, and the songs are memorable.
And they're about something, right? They're topical,
Yeah.
or something about what's going on in the world.
Yeah, and they're and often, and sometimes they can be silly and they can be fun, but they're mostly just songs of your life, you know. And there's something so very, very special about the music. Starting, interestingly, most probably, I mean, when I was a kid, you know, and there was like Mac the Knife, and there were songs like that on Top 40 Radio, and those were pretty cool. I mean, that was the beginning. That was the beginning of rock, you know, for all intents and purposes that we remember. And some of that was very progressive. It just didn't have that name yet. Some of those songs still get played on a top 40, on a classic rock radio station,
Mm-hmm.
digging way deep and wide. But
In general, though, don't you think a lot of classic rock stations in America now make 1964 the beginning?
well, the British invasion is everything.
Yeah.
The British invasion changed the world. And remember, the Beatles came the same year that John F. Kennedy got killed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, America had just gone through a horrible thing and was still in it. It was almost not recoverable, and especially if you were a kid watching that whole thing that happened, you know, it was. And then a couple months later, they got off the plane in New York, and the next day they were on Ed Sullivan, and we all shared that experience. That was until some Super Bowl, you know, 40 years later. That was the #1 most viewed TV show in history. Everybody was watching it. It was communal. And one of the great things about radio is especially great radio stations, is that they have a communal aspect to them. And Ed, for all of his not hipness, was the perfect purveyor of this communal experience. They played 4 songs that night on the first night, and I don't know anybody who was alive then who wasn't watching it.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, and to me, and every musician that I talked to who's old enough to have been watching it has said to me, that's when I decided I was going to be a professional musician.
Yep, they inspired a lot of bands to suddenly buy guitars and keyboards and all that, and form bands, and so that you had a whole new organic movement in the 60s, I think. And wouldn't you consider that kind of the beginning of how freeform and progressive evolved?
Well, when you think about it, Top 40 Radio was still tight even then. Okay. But they'd play 8 Beatles songs from the new album.
Mm-hmm.
And they were like, oh my God, look, I can remember listening to WABC in New York from Florida, because they were, 50,000 watt clear channel, and you could pick them up at night, and they would become WABC. And they were,
with Murray the K, right? Or was he on another station? He was on WINS.
He was on 1010 Wins New York.
Yeah.
And but Scott Muni was there, okay, as a top 40 disc jockey, and so was Cousin Brucey. Okay, and they would have that jingle, WA, or the sweeper, WA Beatles C, and then they would play a song that their competitor didn't have yet,
Mm.
and they would play that WA Beatle thing over it about 5 times so that their competitor couldn't tape it off of the air and play it,
Mm-hmm.
and they'd get the advance album from England because it would come out like 3 days earlier, and they'd play every song on it. So it was so excuse me, it was so unheard of to be playing every song from an album. We were used to little teeny things with a big hole in the center, and all of a sudden we became an album-oriented group of young people. We went from singles to albums, and it started with the Beatles.
And Sergeant Pepper was a one of the main core albums of that whole thing, right?
In 1967, The Summer of Love, okay, when that album came out, it changed the world. But just as they changed the world when they got here and got off that plane and went on Ed's show 4 times, Sergeant Pepper was a concept album. What is that? And I can tell you that when I would I was 20 years old, and when I would go visit my friends, or I'd go over to somebody's house, or I'd go to somebody's apartment, or wherever, when they opened the door, Sergeant Pepper was playing in their house. You walked into Sergeant Pepper, you left with Sergeant Pepper playing. It was that big of a deal. And
bigger than top 40 radio.
well, you think about this, there was no single.
Right.
There was no single on
Right.
Sergeant Pepper. So if you were a top 40 radio station, you had 2 options there. You could either, one, decide which song you were going to make your single, or 2, you could be left in the dirt.
Yeah.
Well, every other kid that you were trying to reach, be they 14 or 24, still a kid, right? Everyone that you were trying to reach, they were all listening. They were wondering why you weren't playing the whole thing. Some people started playing more than one song.
Like you at in Cocoa Beach, right? That's where you started doing progressive radio in 1967.
Yeah, late '67. I owned a coffee house, an electric coffee house, where all the cool garage bands played, and a guy walked in, and he was in charge of a new radio station that was going to come on to compete against the top 40 station, but it was going to compete as another top 40 radio station, and I, through persuasion, convinced him that there's all this music that's being put out right now that the people that you really want to reach are listening to, and top 40 radio isn't playing it. They're playing a couple tracks, they're playing a couple songs, a couple singles from these albums, but there was so much more. And I started playing all this music for him, and he was like, that could really be a format, couldn't it? And I was like, yeah, that's what I'm saying here. Yeah, that's kind of what I'm saying to you. Is I'll help you do this. Let's do. So they agreed, and we started WTAI, and we actually beat the top 40 radio station within about 6 months.
Wow. And that was the first progressive rock station in the South, the entire South?
It was the first progressive rock station in the entire South.
Was that before Tom Donahue in San Francisco or LA?
It was the same timing. Same timing. He was doing it at KMPX before KSAN.
Yeah.
And in New York, there were a couple of different tries at it. WOR tried at it, but then Metro Media, and that in New York happened, and that was WNEW. So that was a big deal. But the way that happened is really interesting, because I'm involved in this documentary where that's tracing that period of time, and and I remember it well because I wasn't there physically, but I was there as part of the counterculture of radio that was doing this, and we all knew what each other were doing, and 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 there was a walkout, okay, at those radio stations, the two stations that Donahue oversaw, both in San Francisco and L.A. The suits came in and decided that you guys can't be doing that on the air, smoking that stuff, or why are you wearing T-shirts? You need to wear a suit, because disc jockeys wore suits in those days, but not at those radio stations, right? We wore, T-shirts and shorts and sandals, and we're crazy, and and they walked out. Oh, and then their checks started to bounce. Okay, and then their checks started to bounce, and so there were. First, they walked out in San Francisco, and then in L.A. they joined them. So there was the great walkout, and what was really funny is that the radio station wanted to get these guys back, but they didn't know how to do it, and they couldn't cave on this simple thing of letting them just do great radio. And Donahue met with the people at Metro Media, KSAM, a real company, and said, I can bring the entire staff over here tomorrow, and you'll actually have advertisers on the air who love this from day one. Let's do it. And they said, okay. And he said, don't you guys own a station in LA also? And he knew. And they said, yeah. And he said, we need to do it there too. So then KSAN and KMET debuted on the same day, one in LA, one in San Francisco, with the exact staffs that walked out of those other places. And then and it immediately started to work gigantically, and Metro not stupid. They were like, okay, it's working in San Francisco and LA immediately. We own a station in New York.
Let's do it there too.
next thing you knew, it was on WNEW, and they didn't have they didn't have these guys already built in to go, but they grabbed a number of guys who were doing progressive kind of shows on the top 40 radio stations. Babalu and his all-night satellite. Scott Muni, who could play anything he wanted to because he was Scott Muni, and they grabbed those guys, and those guys really became the heart and soul of New York underground progressive rock radio. There was WBAI, which was the non-commercial radio station, which is still in existence, but it didn't have the power,
right? The reach
of a WNEW. So and then there were a smattering of other radio stations around the country came along, but they were really the starters. And we in the South, of all places, Cocoa Beach was an interesting area in that it was Cape Canaveral. We were shooting missiles off from there. Astronauts were going into outer space from there. And it was also the best surf on the East Coast of America. So that also brought a lot of guys from California. So we were kind of like a little California there, and it was like really easy to.
In other words, there was a music scene there that actually a lot of musicians migrated from there to California, right?
That's also true. It's amazing. That again, I mentioned this documentary. As I've been talking to the documentarians that I'm working with who are doing this, and they're like real documentarians. It's not like guys who are going, "Oh yeah, I'm a documentarian," And I said, you should do a documentary on the Florida garage band scene of the 60s. And they were like, well, who, why? And I said, well, let's see. That's Greg and Dwayne Allman. They were the Almond Joy. Mudcrutch, that was Tom Petty. And within walking distance of Tom Petty's house with Bernie Leadon and all these other guys who ended up in the Eagles. And there was, and Leonard Skinner in Jacksonville, and Jim McGuinn, who became Roger McGuinn. And there was what was that guy's name? He was in some band called The Doors. He grew up there. Jim Morrison, he grew up in Melbourne, Florida, and he went to Florida State University before he went to UCLA Film School. And Stephen Stills was from Tampa. You know,
Mm-hmm.
the list goes on and on and on. I mean,
Grace Slick came from
who?
Florida to San Francisco. Grace Slick.
Grace Slick, yeah. I mean, it's absolutely amazing the amount of people who came out of Florida, and of course, in those days, you had two choices. If you wanted to be a rock and roll star, you either went to New York or you went to L.A. Right? There was no rock music business scene anywhere but those two places, and that's where those were the headquarters of all the record companies. You know, so many of those people then migrated. It would be like, okay, you know, let's go do it. Johnny Depp was in a band called the Kids in Miami, and that's how he ended up in L.A. They went to L.A. to become rock stars, and somebody saw him, and he was so handsome, and they were like, "Kid, you should be in the movies." And the next thing, he was in 21 Jump Street, you know, and he still, and then he opened up the Viper Club anyway, and he still was doing rock and roll, and he still does it today, you know. But it was like everybody went to L.A. to become a movie star or a rock star, or New York. You know, Bob Dylan went to New York and went.
But you had the benefit of kind of harvesting that whole music scene back then in the beginning, early days of progressive radio. And that takes us to, well, let's say the 80s. A lot of that radio died out and was replaced by album-oriented rock stations. But today, the rock landscape is a lot different, I think. It's hard to distinguish rock from alternative, and it's like I don't know, nothing stands out as leading rock bands of this time we're in. But you're overseeing a station, the Goat in Minnesota. Could you explain why that station is different and unique from all this generic classic rock?
Well, yeah. What interesting is classic rock in general. When the first day you listen to a classic rock radio station, and you're of that generation, right? And you find a classic rock station, and the first day you listen, you think, "Oh my God, I found my station. They're playing all my favorite songs from my life, right? You know, the soundtrack of your life." And then the next day you listen, and you think, "Did they play some of these yesterday?" And then by the third day, you're less enamored with them. You're still listening to them because they're still playing songs that you care about, but they're just playing them too often. Okay, and so you go from in a 3 day period of time, or a 3 weeks, depending on how you listen to radio. You go from being very, very excited to, okay, yeah, this is the station I listen to, but it's not necessarily something. It's not a love affair. Okay. And having lived through that, through all iterations throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, and into the 90s myself as a programmer, you know, it was like obvious to me that there were thousands of songs that we played, and they were magnificent. People will say to me, describe the format of the Goat. That's what we call the radio station. And I say, well, you know, there's more than just Layla on the Layla album, you know, and which is a slam at a classic rock station, obviously, but it's very true, you know.
In other words, you don't stick with just the tight playlist of top testing songs. You expand it, and you have adventure to your format.
When we started, we didn't want to push it too far. We started with 3,400 songs, up against a classic rock station in the market that was playing what we call 200 songs. It was most probably really 400 songs, but that's still highly repetitive.
Right.
And when we would say we don't play the same 200 songs over and over and over again, our audience knew exactly who we were talking about, because they thought that's all they played too.
Right.
And we play thousands and thousands of songs. We don't play just Layla, we play Bell Bottom Blues, we play Any Day. We go deep into everything because when you bought a record in 1968 or 69 or 1975 or whatever it is, you brought that thing home and you played every single song on it. We were music junkies. Everybody was a music junkie, and when you brought it home and played it, you played side one, and then you played side two, and then you played side one. You just paid $3.98 for it. You're going to get your money's worth out of it, and you listen to it over and over and over and over again. Sometimes it became like, oh, side one is my favorite, and you just let that one play over and over and over again, and then you discover
like the Cars album. You could listen to that album all the way through a million times.
Yeah. So this is the GOAT is a format built around the songs that its good fortune is I was there when those albums were current, and I was playing them on the radio, so I don't need research to know which ones were really popular. But in so many cases, I mean, there's not a song on Exile on Main Street by the Rolling Stones that you can't play without people going, oh man, yeah, or
great album.
Yeah, or Jefferson Airplane, Volunteers, or Surrealistic Pillow. There's just so many great songs on those albums. They're not restricted to this. Oftentimes, what you hear when you listen to a classic rock radio station is the hit single that got played on the top 40 station because
like the short version of "Won't Get Fooled Again" by the Who.
Well, it's like, if you were a progressive rock radio station and you were playing 6 songs from every album that were in there, or 2 from this album and 6 from that one, and then one day the top 40s all kind of figured out we got to start playing some of this music, and so they started, but they shot themselves in the foot because they would play the short version of a song.
Right, like the short version of "Light My Fire," 3 minutes.
the short it's the short version of "Like a Rolling Stone" by Bob Dylan, right? You know how they edited that?
Was there an edit by Columbia or by radio stations?
By Columbia. Columbia sent it out as a single because record companies were still. It was insane. We're doing progressive rock radio, and the record promotion guy was still a top 40 guy. And they would say things to me like, how come you guys are playing all this stuff? What do you want albums for? Hey, And so they would screw things up as best they could. When they decided, oh, well, this Dylan song seems to be getting a lot of play at these underground radio stations. Well, but top 40 won't play anything that lasts longer than 3 minutes and 30 seconds. Okay. So how did they deal with "Like a Rolling Stone," which was a 7-minute-ish song? They didn't edit it. They did side one of the single was 3 minutes, and then it would fade out, and then you turn the single over and it would fade up, and the rest of the song would play.
Did top 40 stations play the full version of "Hey Jude" by the Beatles?
Yes.
That's probably when they finally said, okay, we'll go along with this.
We've got to play the long version. I mean, it would be like playing the short version of American Pie or something.
Yeah.
It just sound really, really, really stupid.
Right.
But I mean, that was the beauty and that was a real delineation between your underground progressive rock radio station was, we didn't have to say it, but our audience said it. We play the long version. We play the real version.
And that gave your station more musical credibility, like artistic credibility.
Oh my God, yes. We were them. Okay. And the other station was no longer them. It was for the kids. Okay. Somebody who was 16, 17, 20, 19, 15, 14. They were on our side. The top 40 then kind of became the station for little girls and young guys. is the kids station.
Mhm.
And we were the hip cool guys.
Yeah.
We were the hip cool guys. So this Cocoa Beach station was just, it was actually in Melbourne, Augali, Cocoa Beach,
Mm.
or the Brevard County. And it was like, it exploded immediately because we had enough people who just were like, oh my God, they're playing my record collection.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we were the first people who had record collections,
Right. So it
right?
had a very homegrown feel to it then.
Right. You had an album collection.
Yeah.
If you had 50 albums, that was a collection.
Yeah.
Then people ended up with 600 records. And it was like he really had a collection. And then he bought a really good stereo system with great JBL speakers, and it just changed everything in terms of how people listen to music.
Right. It's like you said earlier, it was a soundtrack to people's lives, whereas I don't know if Top 40, even if that format tries to be a soundtrack more than just a stack of high testing records that repeat over and over and over again.
Well, we have a good friend who's very successful playing a large playlist of pop hits.
Mm-hmm.
John Sebastian.
Yeah.
And
Well,
he does.
John also programmed KLOS in Los Angeles, the rock station back in the 70s?
Yeah, and he was my consultant in Milwaukee, and then I hired him again in when I went to Detroit because we were buds, and I liked his style, and he liked mine. So, and we're still friends. And what he's done, and it's really really quite good in Phoenix, is a radio station that has a wide and deep playlist of songs. It's not repetitive. And it's music from your generation,
Mm-hmm.
right? And he plays most probably 1,000 songs, which is a lot. But what it isn't is it's not a cult.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it's not it's its hook is it's not repetitive. The hook of a radio station like the Goat is we are the soundtrack of your life. We play all the music that you love and none of the crap that you don't love.
So that brings us up to the present, in which classic rock, even if in its most generic form, is still like well loved in America. So how would you sum that up? Why the music has been durable all these years?
Well, I mean, the music is great. Okay, for the most part. I mean, even if a station is repetitive, they're still playing great songs. They're playing songs with hooks, songs with guitars, songs with memorable lyrics, songs with people who could actually sing, people who put their heart and souls into what they were doing, were unbelievable in person when you saw them. When I was a kid, we would go to the gym something another, shower of stars, and there'd be like 19 bands playing, and they'd each get 3 songs, right? And that was cool. Okay, but then came this era of bands who could play all night.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you'd go see the Grateful Dead. Get ready. You're going to be there for 5 hours, 6 hours.
And then on a bus for 5 weeks with them.
And I mean, I saw Jethro Tull most probably 5 times, 6 times.
Mm-hmm.
I saw the Airplane 2 or 3 times. Well, I became a concert promoter for a while in the early '60s while I was doing this underground radio station, because much like the top 40 radio stations, the concert promoters, yeah, just like the top 40 promotion guys from the record companies who asked, "How come you guys want albums and not singles?" The concert promoters were all old school also, and they weren't bringing our bands to town. And I thought, well, if they won't, I will. And the first band I booked was Spirit, you
Yeah.
know, and I did Eric Burden and War, and I did Sweetwater and Canned Heat, and the list goes on. And it was just a Procol Harum on New Year's Eve in 1968, you know, and those bands were, and they and it was a show, but it wasn't a show like, hey, let's put on a show. It was a show like, it was a multimedia show, psychedelic power and lights, white indigo light shows. Those guys went out on the road as an entity unto themselves, and you would promote them as much as the bands that were coming to play at your venue. Oh, and white indigo lights will be here, and they would do a wet show behind it, and they would have film strips running while the band was playing, and it was just so sensory extravagant,
Mm-hmm.
but in a cool hip way. It wasn't like,
Right.
oh, how lame is this, what are they trying to do? It was like, it set the tone for what was hip.
Right. Full of imagination and expression that tapped into this wider magical thing, the cultural revolution of that period.
And it lasted for years, and it kind of culminated in, when you think about it, into Woodstock.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and all of those concerts and all of those bands and all of that scene. When Artie Kornfeld put together Woodstock, and everybody claims they were there. but that was because Artie also was brilliant in that he was able to cut a deal to and get money in advance that was like really was very hard to do, and only Artie could have pulled it off. He got money to shoot a documentary film of it.
Oh, right, right.
Okay, and so everybody who says they were at Woodstock really means I saw the Woodstock movie in the theater.
Yeah.
To go along with those other 250,000 people who are actually there.
Mm-hmm.
There were millions and millions of people who are members of the Woodstock generation. And then the triple album that came out on Atlantic Records, and
Mm-hmm.
it took a number of those bands and that were fledgling bands like Santana and turned them into giant stars. So
Mm-hmm.
it turned Sly and the Family Stone into giant stars because everybody had to go see Woodstock. You could not go see Woodstock.
And we don't really have anything like that today, although there's still big spectacles, but they're never really tied in with that kind of cultural awareness.
I mean, it was as they called it, it was like the gathering of the tribes.
Mm-hmm.
It was the gathering of the tribes, and I can there was a time where this meant I get high. Okay, it wasn't the peace sign, it was the high sign, right? So if you were driving down the street and there was somebody hitchhiking and he went like that, you'd pull over and pick him up. Okay, you didn't worry about him being some kind of weirdo, because it was kind of like the only people who knew what it meant were the people who knew what it meant, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it was like a giant club of same thinking people who all were loving this freedom that they had discovered, and it came from the music. Without the music, it wouldn't have existed.
Good point. Well, that sums it up, I think, Lee. That's all we have time for today. It's been great talking with you again. We did an interview on your career back in 2015. That's on my site, playlistresearch.com. You just click interviews and scroll down, you'll find it. And I'll put a link to that with this one too. And I'd love to talk with you more about classic rock and roll in general sometime.
Anytime that you want to, Alex, it's always a pleasure not only talking with you, but seeing your face, and we need to hang.
Yeah, you got it. Too bad we didn't do that in Milwaukee when I was there. I did call you once when I was there, but I wasn't there long enough for us to hang, I think. But one of these times we'll hang.
We absolutely will. I talked to Dallas Cole today, and we laughed about the fact that, you know, of our time spent in Milwaukee together, not together.
Well, good luck with the cold. I guess the cold season is over for now, so now you got Summerfest on the way coming up, huh?
It's 65 degrees here in Milwaukee. We had basically no winter. Global warming, you decide, but we had no winter in Milwaukee. I mean, before we know it, this will be where people go in the winter time to get warm. The one other thing I would include on classic rock songs, and it occurred to me is that part of the reason why they've lasted so long is because they're ubiquitous.
Mm-hmm.
Right. They're in every commercial on television. They're
right.
in every movie and TV soundtrack. They're in video games. They must probably get more airplay there than they do on the radio.
Well, good talking with you, Lee. Talk with you soon.
It's a pleasure, sir.